If a modern-day police officer walked into a bar, shot 3 suspects dead in broad daylight, then disappeared across state lines to avoid trial, would you call him a hero? What if that same man returned decades later and tried to get a movie made about himself portraying not his mistakes, but only his version of justice? That's not fiction. That's Wyatt Earp, the so-called last gunslinger of the West, often immortalized in dusty tales and silver screen glory. But buried beneath that legacy is something far murkier. Today, we're not here to retell the legend. We're here to examine the truth behind it, peel away the mythology, and ask the hard question: was Wyatt Earp truly a symbol of law and order? Or did he become the very thing he once fought against? Welcome to the channel. If you believe history deserves a second look and that heroes should not be above scrutiny, don't forget to subscribe and join us as we expose stories that were never meant to be forgotten. Now let's talk about what really happened. To understand Wyatt Earp, you have to first abandon the romanticized Western fantasy. The dusty saloons, the gleaming badge, the quick-draw duel suivi, all seen that movie. But real history doesn't come wrapped in hero shots. It's messy, brutal, and often contradictory. Wyatt was born into movement literally. His father dragged the family from place to place, chasing opportunity, always looking for the next new start. And maybe that rootlessness shaped Wyatt's own instability. From the start, he flirted with the idea of law enforcement, but equally with its opposite, crime. Before he ever pinned on a badge, Wyatt was already on the wrong side of the law. He'd been arrested for horse theft, thrown in jail, and then escaped custody. This isn't a footnote, it's the foundation of his story. It shows us something crucial. Earp wasn't raised by justice. He was raised by survival. The shift from outlaw to lawman didn't come from redemption. It came from necessity. His early jobs in towns like Wichita and Dodge City were less about honor and more about control. These were rowdy, booming towns where the line between martial and mercenary blurred quickly. Wyatt didn't bring justice, he brought order, and not always fairly. The truth is, his authority often came not from morality, but from force. He didn't just enforce the law, he interpreted it to fit his needs. In fact, his temper, inherited from his iron-fisted father, cost him more than one job. He wasn't just keeping peace, was throwing punches, sometimes literally. Still, he knew how to play the system. When the politics of one town turned against him, he simply moved on to another like a frontier chameleon, adapting to whatever identity would give him power. And yet, somehow, each time he arrived somewhere new, he was able to rewrite his reputation as a man of the law. It was in Dodge City that he met the infamous Doc Holliday. Holliday was everything Wyatt wasn't: sickly, reckless, and known to gamble with his life the same way he did with cards. But their bond became legendary. A partnership born not of noble cause, but of mutual usefulness. They needed each other in a world where allegiance often meant the difference between life and a gravestone. Eventually, Wyatt's path led him to the place that would define his legacy: Tombstone, Arizona. And it's here where the legend begins to unravel. Because in Tombstone, Wyatt didn't just find a job. He found a grudge, one that would lead to blood spilled in a dusty lot behind a corral. And here's where things get complicated. The line between lawman and executioner begins to blur. But before we get to the infamous OK Corral, we must ask, what really drove Wyatt Earp? Was it justice for a community plagued by outlaws? Or was it something more personal? A vendetta? A wounded ego? Perhaps even a desperate need to reclaim control over a world that had stolen everything from him, including his first wife, who died tragically young, just before giving birth. The myth says Wyatt was unbreakable, but history tells a different tale. When Urilla died, Wyatt changed, and not in the poetic, redemptive way old westerns would suggest. He shut down emotionally, turned cold, He drifted into crime, violence, and gambling like a man trying to hurt the world back. The loss didn't forge a hero. It built a ghost, wandering from town to town, leaving behind either a trail of bar fights or blood. This isn't slander. This is history asking us to look again. And perhaps that's what makes Wyatt Earp so unsettling. Not because he was evil, but because he was human, broken, angry, and armed with both a badge and a grudge. So when we place him on a pedestal, we're not just honoring a lawman. We're excusing everything he did when the law got in his way. As we left off, Wyatt Earp had already transformed from a wandering gambler with a dark past into something far more complex, a lawman, shaped as much by grief and rage as by duty. But it was in Tombstone, Arizona, where that complexity would explode into violence, politics, betrayal, and a personal war disguised as justice. Tombstone wasn't just another town. It was a powder keg, lit by silver money, outlaw gangs, and corrupt politics. When Wyatt arrived in 1879, the town was booming thanks to a mining rush that brought with it drifters, gunslingers, and opportunity seekers. But with prosperity came chaos. And chaos, as always, demanded someone to keep it in check. Wyatt wasn't the only Earp in town. His brothers Virgil and Morgan were already established, with Virgil serving as A.U.S. deputy marshal. The Earp brothers aligned themselves with what many considered the law and order faction of Tombstone merchants, city officials, and others who stood to gain from stability. But that automatically placed them in direct conflict with the Cochise County Cowboys, a loosely organized group of rustlers, smugglers, and hired guns who preferred the old ways of the frontier, open carry, no questions asked. But here's the problem. This wasn't a clean-cut battle between good and evil. The cowboys weren't just criminals. They were locals, landowners, sometimes even business partners with the very people who sat in town hall. And the Earps? They weren't entirely impartial peacekeepers. They had political ambition, business interests, and, as we'll see, personal vendettas. One of the first clear signs that Tombstone was headed for a violent reckoning came when a group of cowboys stole 6 army mules. It seems small, but in a town already on edge, it was a direct slap in the face to federal authority. Virgil, acting in his capacity as a marshal, tasked Wyatt with helping recover the stolen property. The Cowboys' leader, Frank Patterson, promised to return the mules but instead showed up empty-handed, smirking, almost mocking the Earps in broad daylight. It wasn't just theft. It was humiliation. And for men like Wyatt, who carried their pride like a second weapon, that couldn't go unanswered. From there, things escalated quickly. The Cowboys were infamous for their drunken outbursts and public shootings. One night, 5 of them, led by Curly Bill Brocious, stumbled out of a saloon and began firing their revolvers into the air, celebrating, provoking, or maybe just reminding the town who really ran things after dark. Town Marshal Fred White attempted to disarm Curly Bill. He reached for the barrel of Brocious' gun and was accidentally, or not so accidentally, shot in the groin. Wyatt, hearing the gunfire, arrived on the scene and didn't hesitate. He walked up to Curly Bill and cracked him over the head with the butt of his pistol, knocking him cold. Fred White died from his wounds shortly after. And here's where the story twists. On his deathbed, Marshal White insisted that the shooting was accidental, that Brocious hadn't meant to fire. That single sentence may have saved Brocious' life, as a mob had already begun forming outside the jail. Wyatt, to his credit, moved Brocious out of town quickly, preventing a lynching. It's a strange moment, one where Wyatt, despite his fury, upheld the appearance of law. But that restraint wouldn't last. Tensions continued to mount, especially as Wyatt's career in law enforcement became entangled in local politics. He was appointed temporary deputy sheriff, but was soon squeezed out by a man named Johnny Behan, a classic frontier politician with an eye on power and little love for the Earps. The two men had clashed before, but Behan's appointment deepened the rivalry. And to complicate matters further, both men were romantically involved at different times with the same woman, Josephine Marcus, a showgirl known around town as Sadie. So now it wasn't just about law and order. It was about ego, reputation, jealousy, and pride, the ingredients of personal war masquerading as public duty. Then came October 1881. It began with a saloon argument between Doc Holliday and Ike Clanton, a prominent cowboy. Voices were raised. Threats were made. By morning, Ike was roaming the streets of Tombstone, armed and looking for payback. Virgil Earp, now the acting city marshal, disarmed him and fined him $25. But that was just the beginning. That same day, Wyatt encountered Tom McClory, Ike's ally. Wyatt asked if he was armed. Tom said no. Wyatt saw the gun anyway, and in typical Wyatt fashion, rather than arrest him, he smashed him in the head with his pistola, brutal and familiar tactic. Now the table was set. Three more cowboys, Billy Clanton, Frank McClory, and Billy Claiborne, arrived. Furious, armed, and spoiling for a fight. Word spread quickly. The cowboys were together, possibly preparing an ambush. Virgil decided to take action. He deputized Wyatt, Morgan, and Doc Holliday. They set out, not to negotiate, but to disarm the group by force. On their way to confront the cowboys, they passed Johnny Behan. According to Wyatt, Behan assured them he had already disarmed the group. That turned out to be false. Whether it was a lie or just incompetence is still debated. But what followed was 30 seconds that would change Western lore forever. The Earps and Doc Holliday walked into the vacant lot near the OK Corral. Witnesses say the cowboys had their hands up. Others claim they reached for weapons. Either way, bullets flew almost immediately. When the smoke cleared, 3 cowboys were dead: Frank McClory, Tom McClory, and Billy Clanton. Virgil and Morgan were wounded. Doc was grazed. Wyatt stood untouched. And Tombstone would never be the same again. But the story didn't end there. It only grew darker, murkier, and more violent. The OK Corral wasn't the climax. It was the trigger. Because for Wyatt Earp, that gunfight wasn't closure. The gunfight at the OK Corral had lasted barely half a minute, but its echo shook Tombstone and Wyatt Earp's life for years to come. In those brief 30 seconds, reputations were destroyed, alliances shattered, and any illusion that this was about law and order was burned to ash. On the surface, the Earps emerged victorious. They stood. The cowboys fell. But winning the shootout didn't mean they won the town. In fact, it marked the beginning of a deeper unraveling. Because as the dust settled, what followed was not celebration but scrutiny. Immediately, public opinion splintered. Some saw the Earps as heroes who'd finally put an end to the cowboy terror. Others saw something far more disturbing: a group of armed men gunning down locals who may have been trying to surrender. Witnesses contradicted each other. Some said the cowboys had their hands up. Others swore they saw them draw first. The official legal process was swift, chaotic, and riddled with bias. Ike Clanton had miraculously avoided getting shot that day, pressed charges. The Earps and Doc Holliday were brought to court. Over 30 witnesses were questioned. One of them was none other than Sheriff Johnny Behan, who told the court that the cowboys had made it clear they wanted no fight, that they'd turned out their coats to prove they were unarmed. Behan's testimony should have carried weight. After all, the county sheriff. But the court wasn't blind to his motives. Behan had a long-standing feud with the Earps. He'd competed with Wyatt for the sheriff's post. He'd lost Josephine Marcus to Wyatt. And now, in this moment of political opportunity, He didn't hesitate to turn the courtroom into a battleground. Despite the drama, the judge ultimately ruled there was insufficient evidence to indict Wyatt, his brothers, or Doc Holliday. No trial, no prison, no punishment. But that doesn't mean they walked away unscathed. The cowboy faction wasn't about to let the death of their men go unanswered. And the townsfolk? They weren't exactly sleeping easy. The so-called peacekeepers had just shot 3 men in cold blood. Depending on whom you asked, the sense of law and order in Tombstone had fractured. And in that crack, vengeance began to grow. The retaliation came quickly and cruelly. One night, while walking down a Tombstone street, Wyatt Earp was ambushed. A shotgun blast ripped through his left arm and shoulder, shattering bone, ending his career in law enforcement, and leaving him permanently maimed. It was a clear message, a warning, or perhaps just the start. 3 months later, Morgan Earp was gunned down. He had been playing billiards with friends when bullets crashed through the windows from the dark street outside. One of them struck his spine. He died less than an hour later. This wasn't justice. This was war. And for Wyatt, something inside him finally broke. Until that moment, Wyatt had at least attempted to work within the boundaries of law. He carried a badge. He appeared in court. He acted under titles: Deputy Marshal, City Lawman, Brother of A.U.S. Official. But that ended the night Morgan died. Wyatt didn't wait for more hearings, more evidence, or another slow process that might lead nowhere. Instead, he formed a posse 8 men handpicked to do one thing: eliminate the enemies of the Earp family, with or without a legal warrant. This became known as the Earp Vendetta Ride. It was no longer about maintaining peace. It was about revenge. Let's be clear, these were not law enforcement operations. There were no arrests, no trials, no due process. Wyatt and his men were now riding under no official capacity. They were armed, angry, and untethered, a rogue faction serving their own brand of justice. And that begs the uncomfortable question: when does a lawman become an outlaw? Because in the weeks that followed, the bodies began piling up. Cowboys affiliated with the Clantons and McClorys were tracked down and executed. One of them was none other than Curly Bill Brocious, the same man who had shot Fred White and been saved from lynching by Wyatt himself. This time, there was no saving. According to legend, the final confrontation between Wyatt and Curly Bill was straight out of a dime novel. They met in a swampy clearing, guns drawn. Curly Bill fired first and missed. Wyatt, calm and deliberate, returned fire and shot him dead from 50 feet away, right through the chest. Whether every detail is accurate is still debated. What's not debated is the result. Curly Bill was dead, and Wyatt didn't stop there. But by this point, even those who had once supported the Earps began to question them. Because justice, when driven by personal pain, rarely stays clean. The Vendetta Ride wasn't seen by all as noble. In fact, Sheriff Bean formed his own posse and pursued Wyatt across the Arizona territory. Though he never managed to catch up, the message was clear: Wyatt Earp was now a fugitive. Think about that. A man once regarded as a protector of law had now become the very thing he was sworn to oppose. He fled Arizona, heading into New Mexico, leaving a trail of blood behind him and a town more divided than ever. And yet, in the years that followed, Wyatt would never be prosecuted. There would be no formal charges, no accountability for the deaths that occurred during his vendetta. The West, in all its lawless glory, simply let him go, which forces us to ask, how many of Wyatt's killings were truly self-defense? And how many were cold acts of retribution, masked by the chaos of frontier law? Wyatt Earp had lost his brother. He'd nearly lost another. His faith in the system was shattered. And instead of rebuilding trust in the law, he did something far more dangerous: replaced it with himself. That decision would follow him for the rest of his life. Because once you trade in the badge for bloodlust, no amount of storytelling can cleanse the truth. After slipping out of Arizona, Wyatt Earp vanished into the shadows of the West, not as a fugitive in chains, but as a man untouchable by the law he'd once sworn to uphold. There were no arrest warrants that stuck, no grand jury indictments, and no apologies. Instead, Wyatt did what he'd always done best. He moved on. Reinvention was, after all, his greatest talent. But reinvention has its cost. And as he drifted from territory to territory, Wyatt slowly began to trade gunpowder for something else. Image. He wasn't just running from enemies anymore. He was running from history itself. He left behind Tombstone. But Tombstone didn't leave him. The first stop was Colorado, where Wyatt and his common-law wife, Josephine Marcus, tried to rebuild their lives away from the stares and whispers of Arizona. They gambled. They prospected. They moved again. Dodge City, San Diego, San Francisco, the list is long. In every town, Wyatt wore a different hat: saloon owner, real estate speculator, even referee for early boxing matches. But one thing remained constant: his need to reshape the narrative. He rarely spoke of the Vendetta ride, and when he did, it was with carefully chosen words, always emphasizing duty, never revenge. By the 1890s, Wyatt was no longer feared. He was aged, graying, and increasingly concerned with legacy. The world around him was changing. The Wild West he once ruled had been replaced by train schedules and telegraphs. Lawmen no longer carried Colt revolvers, they carried paperwork. And the young no longer revered gunfighters. They revered stories. That's when Wyatt made a pivot that would define the rest of his life. He turned to the one frontier that still worshipped legends: Hollywood. In his final years, Wyatt Earp settled in Los Angeles, where he became an unpaid consultant on silent Western films. Imagine that this man, who had once gunned down outlaws in dusty real towns, now stood behind the camera, advising actors how to make it look real on set. Directors like John Ford would later say they shook Wyatt's hand. That handshake alone became a kind of ritual, a link to a past so violent it needed performance to be palatable. Wyatt began to whisper his own story into the ears of writers, screenwriters, journalists, anyone who would listen. He wanted a book. He wanted a movie. He wanted the final word. But here's the twist. The version of his life he told was not the one he lived. He downplayed his arrests, glossed over the fact that he once ran brothels, reimagined the Vendetta ride as an honorable mission rather than an unlawful manhunt. And in this carefully manicured version of events, Wyatt was not just a survivor, was the embodiment of justice. This was the moment the myth was born. But even as Hollywood embraced him, real life continued to haunt him. One of the deepest personal wounds was his slow estrangement from Doc Holliday. Doc had been by Wyatt's side in nearly every major confrontation, most notably the OK Corral. He had risked his life for the Earp family, had taken bullets beside them, had been branded a killer because of them. But after the Vendetta ride, their paths diverged. The violence that bound them together began to erode what little trust remained. By the time they saw each other again only twice more in their lives, their bond was a ghost of what it once was. Their final meeting took place in Colorado. Doc was dying. Tuberculosis had withered him into a fragile shell. He could barely walk, could hardly breathe. Wyatt brought Josephine, who was reportedly shocked by how much the man had changed. This was no longer the fiery gambler who once spat in death's face. This was a man counting the days, waiting for the coughing to stop. And that encounter says something powerful, not just about friendship, but about time. The gunslingers of the West didn't just kill others. They were slowly, quietly being erased by modernity. The world didn't need them anymore. Wyatt Earp lived until 1929, dying in Los Angeles at the age of 80. He outlived all his siblings, He outlived every man he ever shot. He left behind no children-only tales. And as he slipped into the grave, his legend had already begun to harden into fiction. It's worth noting that Josephine Sadie, as she was often called, fiercely protected Wyatt's reputation after his death. She destroyed letters, discouraged journalists, and fought against any portrayal that didn't fit the myth. She understood that what Wyatt left behind wasn't a will, it was a brand. And that brand would bring in royalties, books, films, and admiration from generations who never heard a gunshot ring out in the desert. But the cost of myth-making is truth. And the cost of truth is discomfort. We don't like our heroes flawed. We want them noble, brave, clean. We want justice to be something you can holster and fire when necessary. But Wyatt Earp's life reminds us that real justice is never that simple. It's messy. It's political. It's personal. And sometimes, it looks like revenge. Wyatt didn't die a millionaire. He didn't die in a blaze of glory. He died in bed, in a rented home, whispering stories to studio men who'd soon turn them into scenes that sold tickets. And maybe that's the final irony. After a life spent chasing power with a gun, Wyatt Earp finally found immortality with a script. As we saw in the last chapter of Wyatt Earp's real-life odyssey, he didn't die in a duel or on the run, but in the quiet streets of Los Angeles, surrounded not by lawmen or outlaws, but by producers, publicists, and studio secretaries. For a man whose name was built on the echo of gunfire, his final chapter played out not in the Wild West, but in the illusion factories of early Hollywood. And that's where the story shifts, not in action, but in interpretation. Because in truth, Wyatt Earp died a man with a tarnished past, but was reborn as a symbol of American justice, a product of film, pulp, and nostalgia. A man who wasn't entirely noble in life but became unshakably noble in memory. The process didn't start by accident. It was strategic. Throughout his final years, Wyatt actively courted writers and filmmakers, feeding them selective memories and shaping the script of his own legacy. He'd sit down with journalists and drop carefully curated anecdotes, omitting, of course, the theft charges, the brothel work, and the Vendetta killings. He wanted to be remembered not as a man who abandoned the law, but as someone who embodied it under fire. And Hollywood, hungry for heroes, obliged. The silent film era was fertile ground for myth-making. Real accuracy wasn't just unnecessary, it was inconvenient. What mattered was narrative, good versus evil, law versus chaos, the badge versus the bandit. Earp, with his lined face and real trigger finger, became a living relic. The last surviving gunfighter from an era the nation was already romanticizing. What followed was a cultural transformation. The man who once skirted legality and took justice into his own hands became a heroic archetype replicated, reimagined, and elevated in countless westerns over the next century. Films like My Darling Clementine, Gunfight at the OK Corral, and later Tombstone and Wyatt Earp didn't just borrow from his story, they rewrote it. In those retellings, Wyatt isn't conflicted or morally gray. He's principled, steely-eyed, just. It's worth asking, why do we, as a society, embrace these sanitized versions of violent men? The answer may lie in timing. Wyatt died in 1929, just as America was entering the Great Depression. People needed clarity, stability, and above all, heroes. The rise of the Western genre filled a gap in national identity. The cowboy lawman, righteous and unbending, became a symbol of order in uncertain times. Wyatt Earp, conveniently, fit the mold, even if he didn't deserve it. Because what the films almost never show is the aftermath, the slow corrosion of law, the blurred line between retribution and murder, and the moral ambiguity that haunted those still living in the towns he left behind. Tombstone, after all, didn't become peaceful after the OK Corral. It became divided. Virgil was crippled. Morgan was dead. The cowboys retaliated. And Wyatt fled. Not exactly the resolution fit for a silver screen. But by the 1940s, the public no longer wanted historical truth. They wanted affirmation. And the image of a lawman who made hard decisions and walked away untouched provided just that. The problem is, this myth didn't just rewrite one man's life, it rewired how we define justice. Wyatt Earp's story became the template for the righteous outlaw trope. The idea that if you're right enough, moral enough, or aggrieved enough, you can do anything, even kill outside the law, and still be called a hero. That's not just a storytelling issue. That's a social one. Because it feeds a larger myth that law and morality are interchangeable, when in fact, they often collide. It also frames violence as a necessary, even noble, tool. In Earp's myth, violence isn't a failure of diplomacy, it's proof of character. The more decisive the gunfire, the more justified the cause. And that, over time, seeped into more than just films. It became a part of American self-perception. But what happens when a culture idolizes the man who walks into the street and shoots first? What happens when we teach generation after generation that justice comes from the barrel of a gun? As long as the shooter wears a badge or looks determined enough. These aren't abstract questions. They ripple through our legal system, our politics, and our media. Every time a controversial figure is excused because they meant well or they had no choice, we're echoing the logic that excused Wyatt Earp's Vendetta. And here's the twist. Wyatt wasn't even comfortable with all of this. There are accounts suggesting that in his last years, he was frustrated with some of the portrayals. Maybe they didn't go far enough in praising him. Or maybe they strayed too far from what really happened. We'll never know for sure. But what's clear is this. Wyatt Earp didn't become famous for what he did. He became legendary for what we wanted him to have done. That distinction matters. Because when we substitute real history with cleaner fiction, we don't just lie about the past, we shape a present built on those lies. And Wyatt's legacy is a perfect case study in that phenomenon. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't a villain. He was something harder to categorize. A man with good intentions, unchecked authority, and deep wounds. A man who broke laws to avenge his family, and then spent the rest of his life convincing the world he had never crossed a line. Whether or not you believe him isn't the point. The real question is, why did we so eagerly choose to believe him in the first place? Because Wyatt Earp didn't just become a legenda, became a mirror. A reflection of everything Americans want to believe about justice, resolve, and moral certainty. But like any mirror built on myth, the image is distorted, polished, and simplified. And the danger of such simplicity is that it allows us to skip the uncomfortable questions. Let's go back to the core of Earp's story. A man loses his brother. He's fed up with legal delays, bureaucratic games, and corrupt officials. So he acts. He finds those responsible and kills them. Without warrants. Without trials. It's emotional. It's swift. And it's clean, at least on the surface. That kind of story is incredibly satisfying. It plays to our instinctual sense of fairness. An eye for an eye. A wrong must be righted. And in a world where justice can feel endlessly delayed, it's easy to see the appeal. But what's often overlooked is how slippery that logic becomes when applied broadly. Because if one man is justified in becoming judge, jury, and executioner, what stops others from claiming the same right? And what if they're wrong? Wyatt Earp's legacy has inspired more than just Western films. It's become a cultural template, especially in American media and law enforcement narratives. The lone figure who operates outside the rules because the rules don't work. The man who has to do what's necessary. The officer who breaks procedure to get results. The vigilante who knows better than the system. You've seen it 1,000 times, not just in cowboy hats, but in suits, uniforms, tactical vests. From cop dramas to political speeches, the language of righteous disobedience is everywhere, and the roots of that language can be traced, in part, to how we mythologized Wyatt Earp. But there's a deeper irony here. The very thing that made Wyatt's actions so controversial in his time, his disregard for the law when it suited him, has, over generations, become the most celebrated part of his persona. His refusal to let the courts handle things, his decision to kill rather than wait, is now seen by some as courage rather than collapse. This raises a chilling question. When does a legend stop reflecting values and start reshaping them? The more we retell the story of Wyatt Earp as heroic, the more we subtly reinforce the idea that justice is most effective when it's personal and violent. That restraint is weakness. That process is failure. That law only matters when it aligns with emotion. And when those messages repeat over time, they don't just stay on screen. They bleed into policy, into policing, into public discourse. Consider how often real-life cases involving violence by authority figures are defended with Earp-like logic. He had no choice. The courts were too slow. He did what had to be done. It's the same myth, updated for modern news cycles. But if we rewind the story, we see how flawed that foundation really is. Wyatt Earp didn't operate in a vacuum. He wasn't a lone wolf with nothing to lose. He was part of a powerful family, connected to federal marshals, with personal interests and grudges. His actions weren't always pure, and his motivations weren't always just. He was hurt, he was angry, and he wanted payback. There's no shame in admitting that. It makes him human. But what's troubling is how we erase that humanity to build a statue, one that overlooks the blood at its feet. The people Earp killed during his Vendetta ride didn't get due process. Their guilt wasn't proven in court. Some may have deserved consequences. Yes, but that's not the point. The point is that a man used the memory of his brother as a license to kill, and we applauded him for it. We still do. But maybe we need to ask, if justice requires abandoning the law, is it still justice? Or is it just vengeance dressed in a badge? This isn't a call to tear down Wyatt Earp's memory. It's a call to look at it honestly. Because true legacy isn't about perfection, it's about complexity. And Wyatt's life is a case study in contradiction. A lawman who broke the law. A hero with no clear moral center. A man who helped define a genre by escaping the consequences of real history. We often say the past shapes the present. But sometimes, it's the version of the past we choose to remember that does the shaping. Wyatt Earp, in his own time, was a deeply polarizing figure. Feared by some, admired by others, respected, reviled, and then, through the slow churn of myth and media, that nuance was stripped away. All that remained was the clean, iconic silhouette, the stoic lawman standing in a dust-choked street, facing down the chaos of the frontier. But that silhouette is a shadow, and behind it was a man, wounded, flawed, dangerous, a man worth studying not because he was perfect but because he wasn't. And perhaps that's the real caution buried beneath the legend. That even the most admired heroes are just people, and when we forget that, we risk becoming blind to the cost of calling violence noble. The legend of Wyatt Earp didn't just survive history. It replaced it. And in doing so, it left us with a question we still haven't answered. Maybe the most unsettling part of Wyatt Earp's story isn't what he did, but how we've chosen to remember it. We took a man forged in grief, revenge, and gray morality, and sculpted him into a symbol of clear-cut righteousness. We turned a complicated human being into a one-dimensional icon, and somewhere along the way, we stopped asking the hard questions. We stopped wondering what happens when justice is served from the barrel of a gun. We stopped questioning the cost of letting anger wear a badge. We stopped seeing the difference between law enforcement and emotional retaliation. And the more we celebrated the myth, the more we buried the truth. Not just about Wyatt Earp, but about how easily we can trade accountability for simplicity and call it history. So maybe the real lesson isn't about him. Maybe it's about us. About how we, time and again, fall in love with stories that make us feel right even when they leave us blind. And maybe the next time we hold up someone as a hero, we ought to ask, are we honoring who they truly were, who we need them to be? Thank you for staying with us until the very end. And remember, subscribe Dark History Vault to the channel so you don't miss a single truth they tried to keep buried. See you next time.